You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. A few months ago at Photoville 2018, we had the pleasure of speaking to today's guests, Ron Haviv and Lauren Walsh, about a project they're working on called Lost Rolls America. Ron Haviv is an Emmy-nominated, award-winning photojournalist and co-founder of the photo agency Seven. He's been dedicated to documenting conflict and raising awareness about human rights issues. He's worked in over 100 countries, covered more than 25 conflicts, and along the way has published 4 books, including Blood and Honey, a Balkan War Journal, Afghanistan, The Road to Kabul, and Haiti, 12 January 2010. His most recent book, The Lost Rolls, led to the project we're going to be discussing today, Lost Rolls America. Lauren Walsh, who we also had the pleasure of speaking with at Photoville, is a writer and professor at both the New School and NYU, where she's the director of the Gallatin School's Photojournalism Lab. Lauren is the editor of Macondo, a photo book documenting the long-term conflict in Colombia, and co-editor of the collection The Future of Text and Image. She's also the co-editor of the Millennium Villages Project, a photography book on efforts to relieve extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. Her latest book, Conversations on Conflict Photography, examines the value of documenting war and humanitarian crisis in the contemporary moment. She's also currently co-directing with Ron Haviv Biography of a Photo, a documentary film about 2 iconic images of conflict that have shaped the course of history. Welcome, Lauren. Welcome, Ron. Great to see you guys again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
This project, we were talking just before the show started up, we've been reviewing it lately, and it's more than just pictures from rolls of film that people are finding. It's an incredible insight into people's connection to photography. Before we start talking about, bring us up to date about how this project started with 200 rolls of film and how it got to where it is today.
Well, it started actually with a conversation with Dan Milner, a photographer at large and amazing expert on photography who works with Blurb, the on-demand publishing company. Sure. And Blurb had just come out with new technology to do traditional press photo books. And they were looking for people to work with to show how great the quality of these books were. And so Dan came to me and said, hey, do you have an idea for a book? And I kind of thought about it and kind of batted around some ideas. And I said, Dan, I've got like 30, 40 rolls of film in a Ziploc bag in my studio that I shot. I don't really know what's on it. Maybe we should kind of take a look at that. And he said, oh, sure, we'll pay for the processing, which is obviously expensive, especially for a freelance photographer like myself. So I was like, okay, great. And we sent off the film and we got the pictures back and it was like, this is kind of interesting. It was a mix of personal and professional. And I said, Dan, this is kind of interesting. I have another 60, 70 rolls of film that I just found. He says, okay.
While we're at it.
Yeah, while we're at it. So yeah, come on, let's do that one. And we did that and we're like, wow, this is really getting interesting. So Dan, I have another 100 rolls of film that I found, kind of basically going through my studio and finding bags where former assistants to sort of tuck them into filing cabinets and so on, stuff I didn't even know where it was, and kind of collected as much as I could find. And we processed all the film. And what kind of started out is, 1, a exercise to just get film developed, and then 2 was like kind of, this could be a kind of like gimmicky kind of thing. All of a sudden turned into something much more serious. And as Dan and I started to look at the work as it kind of came across and Dan started to question me about some of the photographs, which were connected, of course, to my life and about my memory, what I remembered, what I didn't remember, and how we were looking at a number of the images had actual physical mold on it and color shifts. And it was a mix of everything from processing Kodachrome in a black and white process lab to color neg to slide film that, the greens had shifted and so on. And other stuff like black and white film, Tri-X that came out, like was shot 20 years ago and was perfect. And those sort of changes on the degradation of the film started to mirror my own sort of degradation of my own memory. As I'm getting older, I was starting to realize that I wasn't remembering everything. And I was starting to look at photographs and I would not know where these photographs were taken. I didn't know who the people were. I didn't know what was happening. And one of the things throughout my career, having documented so many historical moments from 1989 till present, that people would often come to me and say, do you have a diary, or do you take notes? And I say, like, no, I don't, because I know that whenever I look at a photograph, I can tell you what's happening in that photograph, what happened before and what happened after.
And suddenly
I couldn't. I realized by not having that connection of processing the film within a certain period of time after shooting it, I lost that bond between or the metadata creation. I lost it. And this became, one, very disconcerting to me. Again, kind of talking about my own kind of memory, but also kind of this fascinating kind of exploration. And there were also all of a sudden photographs kind of appearing all of a sudden of a great friend, Alexandre Boulard, who was one of the founders with me at Seven, who passed away a few years ago. And all of a sudden she pops up on the screen at a wedding. And it was like all of a sudden these like bittersweet, like I'm so happy to see her. She's smiling. She looks beautiful, but at the same time kind of acknowledging, the loss of a friend. Or there was another series of photographs of these people, middle-aged couple, or maybe a little bit older, looking at me like I'm family. It was like kind of one of those family pictures. I had no idea who they were. I went around to my family. Nobody knows who they are. And to this day, I have no idea why these people are on my film. And then I also...
and it was your film, though?
It was, yes, because there were other images on that roll that I recognized,
okay.
but not...
All right. Can I ask a question real
Sure.
quickly? I mean, were there any chance that there would have been, an incredibly important photograph in any of these films? I mean,
so happens there were a few photographs, primarily because basically, I guess the first question is people ask, like, as a professional photographer, how could you wind up with so many rolls that you never developed? And actually,
it's easy.
It's easy, but also just to explain it. So basically, the 200 rolls of film is from 25 years, right? So you're talking about less than 10 rolls a year. And what actually happened was, especially in the beginning of my career, where it was so expensive to process, I would go and shoot something on spec, then I would pitch it. And if nobody was interested, I would just put the rolls aside and said, later, when I have money, I'll develop it. And that never happened. And then as I got more successful, I would say go off and do an assignment for the New York Times Magazine. And Kathy Ryan would say, okay, we want to shoot it this way in color. And I would put all my energy into that. But I'd also have a 2.25 black and white camera just to give her an option of something. And sometimes the editor, whether it's Kathy or somebody else, would say, yeah, we'll process it. And other times they'd say, nah, we're not really interested. And I also would kind of put it aside. Or, now I know this is like, again, going way back to the days of film, but there were times when, let's say you're shooting an event in New York. You're inside shooting a press conference. You're shooting tungsten 320, and all of a sudden you have to run outside. You've only shot 5 frames on that roll. You rewind it. I'll shoot it later. You put it in the bag. Then you go to the airport 5 times and you realize, oh, that roll of film is still there. I'm not going to give that to anybody. And you put that aside. So it's kind of all these mix of different things, and then stuff of my family or girlfriends or so on, kind of all getting kind of mixed up into piles, so that eventually winds up into this amalgamation of a lot of rolls and kind of these little snippets of my life. And it was so this book, The Lost Rolls, became this sort of fascinating conversation about memory, about the end of the analog era, about my own life. And the first thing that started this sort of conversation on the bigger picture was that I asked Lauren. Lauren and I had met. She had interviewed me for her book, Conversations on Conflict Photography, and Lauren's an expert on memory and photography. So I asked her to write one of the essays in the book. The book was published, and they went out on this book tour. And as I traveled around the United States, I would ask people, who here has a roll of film, an undeveloped roll of film that's exposed, sitting in a camera or box? And almost always, more than 50% of the audience would raise their hand. And they say, I don't know what to do with it. The photomat is gone. Right. I don't know. I have no idea what to do with this film, or there's no place to do it, or we just put it aside and started shooting with our iPhone or whatever, or before that, the Instamatic. So there were all these different variations of things that replaced kind of traditional negative film shooting. And at that point, I was like, wait a minute, this is really interesting. And then I started to hear stories. Like one friend of mine came to me and said, my father just passed away. My sisters went to the house to start cleaning up, and he arrived like a day later or something like that. And he asked them, like, what did you guys do today? And they said, oh, yeah, we found a bunch of film. Well, obviously, there's nothing to do with it, rolls of film. So we threw them away.
Oh.
And that's not an unusual story. Like people think like this is basically useless.
But that hurts when you
So they
hear
start
it, right?
throwing away their film. And all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, like this could be a real opportunity, like a call to action, like to save these memories that are locked away, exactly like what happened with me. So basically that was the sort of the birth of Lost Rolls America. And then basically asking Lauren to get involved and Robert Peacock to get involved. And we decided to expand this. And most importantly, we brought FUJIFILM America on board, who are processing and scanning the film free. I mean, this is all for free. And then we're creating this public
nut
archive.
to crack otherwise. That's a major piece. Sure.
So this is a huge part. And I'll let Lauren talk a little bit more about the value of this public archive because it's pretty unique, I think.
One fast question I do have. When you started asking people if they had rolls of film, you said about 50% of the audience would have film.
And their age range is from millennial to up.
Okay.
So there'd be millennials who, like, when they were 15, were given a camera and shot it and then just tossed it aside.
What percentage of these people said, I don't even know it's on this roll, compared to people who said, I have this film, I know it's on it, but I never developed it? You have any idea what the ratio would be between unknown mysteries and...
I would say the majority
did not know what it was.
Submit rolls of film when they say, I'm really not sure what's on here.
Yeah, based on what I read in the archive description.
Okay.
That's
And so
indication,
just as immediately to put out, which is obviously the next question somebody will ask is, I don't want you looking at my film. So we set up a system. Another important partner in the project is PhotoShelter. And so the film gets scanned at CRC Labs here in New York. It's sent over to PhotoShelter to a secure website that only the viewer can see. The viewer then chooses
the one
or two images they want to write about. They can download the scans. The negatives then get returned to them. And basically, we don't go and look at the work. It's completely determined by the people.
So you
now,
haven't
the pictures
seen
that you end up keeping with it, they end up donating to the project. Who owns those pictures? Is it a shared copyright? Do you own them?
We have the rights to use the photographs. It's part of the agreement when people submit to use the photographs in relationship to anything connected to Lost Rolls America.
Gotcha.
But I can't go and give the picture to Getty or sell it to Coke.
Fair enough.
That immediately goes, I'm a photographer. I'm obviously going to protect the rights of photographers.
And you don't take a look at the other. They choose the ones they want, and the rest are unknown to you guys.
Yeah, we never see them.
And how do you feel about that aspect of it? And wondering, as a photographer, an editor, whoever, what if there's something much better on that roll, or much more interesting, or that's of no concern? It's really their memories and their.
It's the power of that archive, and let Lauren go more into it. It's exactly what it is.
I mean, I think it's a different way of thinking about what is better or best when it comes to photography. It's not about the composition or the visual per se, but it's the combination between what you're looking at and the memories and stories that people decide to share. So I think often, I mean, I don't know what else is on those rolls of film, and I don't know what stories don't get shared, but there are some incredibly heartwarming and devastating and powerful and important stories that have wound up in the archive.
And has anybody said, you know what, I don't want to share any of these? Has that happened?
Yeah, there have been people who've submitted rolls and then not uploaded to the archive.
Right. And have conversations continued with these people afterwards about the stories? I mean, obviously long enough to document them and get them in the archive, but have they gone further than what you thought they might have, some of these stories and the relationship to the people?
Well, there's a few that we've started to follow up on. One particular one, it's the oldest photograph in the archive. It's from 1950. And after it was submitted and appeared in the archive, we recognized this is special. It's really, it's a very old photograph. And so we reached out to the woman who had submitted it saying, we'd like to learn a little bit more. I think she initially submitted it and she wrote like post-World War II or something. She kind of gave a vague date, but we wanted to know the specifics of it because normally people try to get as specific as possible. And she did a little bit of research, spoke to family members, and it basically opened an entire world of family lineage to them. So she came back with the date of 1950 and then started telling us things like, this is a photograph of my mother when she was 18 years old. She survived the war. It's the last photograph ever taken of her in Europe before she came here as an immigrant to the United States. And I'd always heard this story, but I'd never seen the image of it. And then she started learning about her own family history and connecting with family members she hadn't spoken to. So that was one story that we dug into.
Yeah, I imagine there's handful more that'll come about like that. No? Now, can I jump back to you for a quick second about the lost roles, your lost roles? Did you find a difference in terms of your memory of photos that you had that were personal photos and photos that were work related or coverage related in terms of how you could remember or what came back to you?
Well, I did remember all the girlfriends, so that was a plus.
Okay. All right.
But yeah, it was nice. There were family photographs. There were other things. There were photographs. There were a few photographs that I had remembered taking but could never find. There was one photograph while I was a Newsweek photographer at the White House and during the Clinton years. And I remember photographing in the Oval Office the carpet with the eagle. And I was like, where is this photograph? What happened to this picture? And all of a sudden now it popped up in one of these roles. So it was kind of interesting because sort of like some memories kind of became complete and were finished. And then all of a sudden other ones were broken and answers will most likely never come about.
Right.
In the case of a photograph, like you just mentioned, you shot for Newsweek in the White House, and now you suddenly have this picture after a zillion years. Who actually owns that picture now? Is that still considered a Newsweek photograph, or at this point is it yours?
As a freelance photographer, I've always owned the copyright to all my work.
All right. That's okay.
And did you find anyone who in Lost Roles America who didn't develop the roll of film for a specific reason? Like they didn't want to develop it because there might have been something on there that would have been too painful to remember, or was it more about just mistakes or things that were overlooked, or the switch to digital and in those eras?
There was one person who we have spoken to and interviewed, and he had a roll of film from
1969.
He didn't say specifically, I don't want to see what's on it, but it was from when he was 18 years old and he had just finished his final tour in Vietnam, and which had, of course, been a mixed bag for him. And he was not sure, he couldn't remember what was on that roll of film, whether it was the final period in Vietnam or his first roll of film shot back home in California, kind of beach party.
Right.
And then he seemed to just kind of delay it. Like, I don't know what it is. I don't necessarily want to see some of this. And he held it for a really long time. And then we did an exhibition in California, and he read about it in the newspaper and came over to see us and handed us his roll of film.
Wow.
And
powerful.
What was the takeaway for them? Was it stuff that he wanted to see at the end of the day, or do you don't know?
It's an interesting story. We're shooting a series of films on Lost Roles America, starting off with the story of the immigrant coming to America, and the second film will be a story about this Marine and what happened with that roll of film. So I think we're going to leave it as a surprise because it's a fantastic story.
That's great.
By the way, you touched on the subject that you are now working on a film project based on the archive. I think it's an amazing idea.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think this has been proven. We've done now two physical exhibitions of Lost Roles America. We had these. The exhibitions were designed in part by Roger Gorman, who also designed the Lost Roles book, and we had this concept. Basically, it came out of a conversation by Laura Romanos from UPI, the people that produce PhotoVille,
yeah, Laura,
right?
sure.
And Laura suggested us having this retro camper, like kind of this representation of Americana. And so at PhotoVille and later at the LA Month of Photography, we got campers. We got a white picket fence. We got AstroTurf lawn, pink flamingos, picnic tables, all sorts of things designed inside the camper with Lost Roles America stuff. And one of the most interesting things that we did was that, well, first, the prints, we had prints all around the camper on the fences and so on. And the prints would basically have the photograph, the name of the photographer, and a quote from what they wrote. And then inside, we recreated what people wrote in terms of like photojournals and letters and so on. And we had people go into the camper and sit there for 45 minutes reading all the stories. I mean, 45 minutes in PhotoVille, where there are dozens of exhibitions and so on. There was a line times waiting to get inside the camper to sit there and read and flip through the photo albums and the journals and so on. And
It's
I
a
think
bit
exactly
addictive.
what you just said. It was like incredible. And the same thing happened in LA. Tell the story about the guy in LA.
There was one person who showed up to the camper that we had set up there, and he was with someone. He was with a friend, and they were walking. We had a bunch of the prints hanging on the outside of the camper, and they were walking around kind of methodically, reading everything, but they were moving very slowly. So I went up to introduce myself to them and to ask them how their experience was. And it turned out that one of the two of them was blind, but he wanted to see the exhibition anyway. So he went with a friend who described every single photo to him and read every single quote.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was surprised by a lot of the people, and I really like the questions that you have, that you ask them about, what they think other people will think of this image. And a lot of them, well, I just think it's boring or whatever, but it's not boring. It's actually kind of fascinating once you dig into it. And I found myself, I thought I was done, and then I go, I want to click on that one too, and then I want to click on this one. But do you, is everything that gets submitted and chosen up in the archive, or will it be, or do you guys decide, okay, you know what, we just want to keep this certain amount, or
how much
who's doing the
editing goes
curating
into
of
it,
this?
if any?
No, we're not doing any.
It's publicly curated. So,
Okay.
I mean, one of the things that we really treasure about the archive is, if you think historically, the way archives work, they're traditionally run by someone or some few people, like whether it's a curator or a historian, and that person has the decision-making power to say, this goes into my archive and that does not go into my archive. So some things get marginalized or never seen or thrown away from history. So we wanted to return that decision-making power to the public. So we have no say over it. And in that sense, it's a completely democratized archive where anyone who submits gets to pick how they're represented, what gets represented about them, and to tell the story in their own voice.
Is the order, when you open up the site, obviously there's the first picture you see and they keep going down. Is there any method to that order?
At this point, it's chronological.
Okay.
So the ones you see first are the last ones that have been entered.
Ah, okay. Have you discovered any rolls of film that are just drop dead amazing as far as being amazing photographs of people who should have maybe been celebrated, but are just good photographers on their own?
I mean, like a Vivian Meyer kind of situation?
Yeah, or anything like that. I mean, just anybody who's, if you go, this is just amazing.
I think there have been a few beautiful pictures.
We only see ever one or two by any one photographer. I mean, I really love that photograph of the little girl that's taken in Spain. It's quite beautiful.
Yeah. That's as nice as anything you'll see in a museum.
And it's interesting to see how, I think was that a Tri-X roll, how that seems to have been preserved. Have you noticed kind of...
Black and white holds up. I mean, the photograph from 1950 is 120 Tri-X. 120 Tri-X from 1950, and it's like the blacks are punchy.
And what formats do you accept and don't accept? And is there any
We don't accept, obviously, Kodachrome, but almost everything else CRC can do. And then for a few specialty places, we found a lab in Pennsylvania that's got a few barrels of specialty quality chemicals. That there are a few unique types of film. So we've been pretty lucky, almost all rolls. But if anybody is questioning whether they should send in the film, just send us an email. We'll double check and make sure we can process their
It's
film.
kind of ironic that Kodachrome, which is probably the most stable color process on the planet that ever existed, you can't do anymore.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've seen Kodachromes from World War II that are still spectacular. I think they're ISO 6 or something like that, or 3, ridiculous, but the colors are still bold. They hold up beautifully. Ektachromes from the 60s and 70s, forget about it. Cyan.
And how much would you say this is about nostalgia? And I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way, but nostalgia for the film era, nostalgia for the life that someone used to have. I mean, a lot of the photos aren't that old; they're from the 2000s, so we're not talking about
Well, 2000 is 19 years ago.
Yeah, I guess
that's,
so. Yeah,
that's quite a ways if you think, especially in the world of photography.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure. I would put this as a nostalgia project. I mean, I think obviously memory kind of crosses into that, but it really is kind of this exploration of people and the way that they remember their own lives and maybe self-identify with something from a certain period of time. I mean, there's some incredible things that have been written. I remember there's a really very simple but nice photograph of a woman at a fountain, black and white photograph from 1969, and the guy is writing like this is me meeting my wife. The last 50 years have just been the most incredible times of my life. And that's the beginning of their relationship. And then on the flip side, there's this really heart-wrenching text from a woman. It's a photograph. It's like a bad flash photograph of her holding a baby with her husband, and she's writing basically every decision she made went wrong, and the love there was gone, and you have no idea what happened.
What happened? Yeah.
There's I think one photograph. It's a picture of a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, and she writes, I'm paraphrasing, something to the point of, it's a beautiful picture unless you know what happens next.
Wow.
It's like, whoa.
And then you want to know what happened next for sure.
And she doesn't say.
Right.
Which is perfect, actually.
And what have you guys learned about memory in relation to photograph from this? Obviously, you study this, and this is your field of expertise. But as I'm getting older too, I realize a lot of my memories are really just photos that I've looked at over the years. I don't even know. I can't even distinguish between, my 5-year-old birthday party and the one photo that's left from it. So are we, kind of forever doomed to give up the control of our memory to images?
I don't think we have to see it as forever doomed. I think they can be helpful because memory, you can't retain everything. So it's nice to have these external tools that'll help you hold on to pieces of it. And what you're describing with over time, the photo itself kind of replaces the experiential memory. This is really common. I think one of the things that's so nice about this process is, aside from some of the photographs leading toward these wistful or sad moments, what I often notice is that there's something magical happening because these aren't the photos that people have looked at again and again and again and again.
Good point.
And instead they get this glimpse into some moment from their past that they probably haven't thought about in a long time, and all of a sudden there it is before them. And there does seem to be a kind of flood of memories that come back once they're looking into the past. I mean, it's kind of, for me, it seems like this telescope into the past.
Yeah, I think it's really remarkable. There's especially photographs that you look at and you're like, what is this? There's like a flash photograph of a feather on a floor.
No, willow branch.
Sorry, willow branch.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You can tell.
It's a really sad one. It's a picture of like pussy willow, just like lying on a wooden floor. And I looked at it, and I confess, I was like, why did they submit this one?
Right.
It just looked boring and strange. And then I read the photographer's memories, and she, again, it was a moment of like the past coming back to her. And she says something along the lines of, I remember snapping that branch and running my fingers over the little pussy willow, the bud, and feeling its softness and thinking, how could something so soft and fragile exist in such a terrible world? And it was the day that someone she knew had died. So it brought back, sad memories for her, and she wrote very beautifully about it. But when you read her words alongside the image, then all of a sudden the image is this tremendous image. It's wonderful.
You just triggered a memory for me of a photograph. Many, many, many years ago, decades ago, I went back to the neighborhood where my mother grew up in Brooklyn, and I was able to get into the building. It was a 4-story walk up on 65th Avenue or something like that. And I remember going there as a kid because it was my grandparents. That's where they lived, so I'd spend weekends there. And it was the old-time stairways with the worn marble steps and the little black and white tiles. And it was just pure 1940s. And I took a picture with there was a window in the hallway just hitting those stairs. And I took a picture of it, and I had shown it to my mom about a week later. And she started crying. She goes, those are the steps between the second and third floor going to my mom's apartment where I grew up. That's where I sat and cried when my sister went for an operation, and I thought I'd never see her again. She has that picture hanging in the room now today. She's 95. But that picture just stopped her and threw her into tears, and was like, wow. So there's a lot of power to photographs.
Yeah, that's exactly it. This archive is another conversation about the power of photography and what it means to us as people and as this tool of capturing our memories, reminding us, being there as historical markers for certain points of our life, which is why I think this project is so important, because a lot of this film / these memories are being lost. And this attempt to remind people not to throw out their film, come to us, if not find a lab, but don't let it just disappear.
And I see, though, kind of regarding this point, you've taken obviously some historic photos and powerful photos in another sense. Has this project kind of forced you to kind of reassess what a power of an image can be, or is this something you kind of always knew and you're just kind of seeing it now in individual cases? But maybe when you were younger, you know, I need to make this dynamic, beautiful, this image that will show everybody what's going on in a certain place and powerfully blow them away. But it doesn't, it could be a photo of a willow branch,
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I'm not sure reassess, but certainly I think appreciate the range. And, I teach a lot. I teach a lot of workshops, and often I have to remind students that they don't have to go to some war zone or huge political story to be able to tell a story that will have impact, that can be in their house, in their backyard, and so on. And this is kind of along those lines, and again, kind of the range of power that photography can have.
We're going to take a short break and come back with more about Lost Rolls America. Stay tuned.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. Send us a tweet at BHPhoto Video, #BHPhoto Podcast.
Okay, we are back. A few more questions we have here.
Do you think this project could work with digital images? I mean, obviously we take a lot of images and some of them we may never look at. So to some degree they're forgotten, they're set aside, and we may, I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I do scroll through my phone and I see a photo that I didn't remember taking or, from 2 or 3 years ago when my kids are a little bit younger or whatever. So do you think that this idea, this project is tied to film necessarily?
It's interesting because typically the way people talk about digital photography is that you see the picture immediately. So you necessarily don't have the same kind of a delay that you have with analog film. And we were really interested in what happens when it's not just the typical delay of I finished this roll of film and I got it processed right away, but the delay becomes 5 years or 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. I don't know, maybe Lost Rolls America 2.0 at some point in the future could think about that, but we're pretty tied to the idea of film.
I think for me, one of the big differences, analog and digital, is the metadata. And especially if you're taking photographs on your phone or using newer cameras that have Wi-Fi, GPS and base, you're always going to most likely know the date.
Yeah.
You're probably also going to know the location. If you're using face recognition through Apple or something else, it's a good chance that there are people often photographed that are identified once. So this kind of idea about digital having images that you really have no idea what's going on, nothing, is almost impossible, as opposed to the fact that most people who are finding film in their closets or drawers or whatever, where there's nothing written on it, doesn't say anything. There's no metadata. They have no idea.
They might remember which camera it was, and that's about it.
Or they might so is that great aunt so and so, or and that's the whole family kind of aspect, the family album. Even forget about even film, unprocessed film. Most people can't identify the people in their family albums unless somebody.
That one relative who knows everything.
Knows everybody, right?
Totally.
So I think it's I think kind of this concept is while there can be morphed ideas within the digital world, it really is this commentary about kind of the analog, this sort of, and even though there's a resurgence of analog film, it's obviously never going to be what it used to be, and so it is trying, once again, kind of this rescue operation for all these rolls of film that are out there.
I think the ultimate rescue I've heard about took place about 20, 25 years ago. There was a family out in the Midwest that was selling off the family farm that had been in the family for 4 generations. And up in the attic, they found a box camera, Brownie, from the early 1900s. And there was a roll of film in it. And somebody had the thought process saying, let's send this to Kodak and see what they can do. And in fact, they got a response that we did a little clip. There's something on it. We might be able to salvage this and see what's on it. We're just going to do it. what the backstory was that the great-grandmother of these kids who were selling with the family farm, when she was about 12 years old, was given a brownie for her birthday. This is like 1909, 1910, whenever these cameras first came out. And she gathered everybody on the front porch of the farmhouse and took a picture. And then put away the camera, and then there was a wedding or a graduation or somebody was born, and she would gather everybody and took another picture, and the film was never developed. And they were able to develop the film and actually make prints, and they sent all the survivors leather-bound albums of essentially their ancestors, who they were then able to identify based on the fact that's grandma taking the picture, and that's her mom and her grandmother. And grandma never even saw these pictures, but her great-grandkids did. And I think that's probably the most unique story I've ever heard about salvaging a roll of film.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
We've had, a couple years ago, a guy who has called the Rescued Film Project.
Sure.
And, and we also had Kendra from the Vietnam Slide Project, a little different, but similar. And have you come across other folks that are doing similar things? And do you see like kind of this common kind of desire to look back at the analog era and reevaluate?
Yeah, I think to some degree, but it is really, I think what Rescue Film Project is doing is really noble and great. Mm-hmm. And there are a few other projects that you find garage sale, you find film or something like that. There's a guy in China who's collecting negatives found in dumpsters and doing so. It's really some very cool things going on. But very specifically for Lost Rolls America, this really is about that personal relationship to the roll. So we're not interested if you found a roll of film.
Some weird orphan film,
Go send that to Rescued Film. Yeah. That's what they do really well. But if it's your film or your family's film, you have a connection to it. Because as much as we're interested in the photograph, we're very interested and feel very importantly connected to is that memory. Yeah. Yeah. And it's the commentary, it's the memory. That's what I think, and I think Lauren would agree, that's what makes this project unique amongst these
There's
other...
a connection between...
Yeah, you're writing about it, right? And what does this mean for you?
Let me ask though, I mean, the people are selecting their photo and then they go up into the archive, but you guys are, I mean, in terms of the exhibitions, somebody must be selecting those images, I'm assuming, and that's not just a random selection, right? I mean, so some sort of curation is going on, at least when you're exhibiting them?
Even at the exhibitions, we try to incorporate every single photograph.
Oh, you do?
In some part.
In some form, yeah.
And I guess my question was really more about this idea that with degradation, sometimes, and of course there's a history of experimental photography and film where, burning the film or some kind of destruction of the film is part of the art. Have you come across, an image that is maybe you can't even tell who's in it, but it just has this beautiful color or shapes or forms that are separate from the memory, and you want to include that, or based on what you just said, that's
well, again, we're not choosing it,
right?
But people are choosing images like that, and they're writing about whatever they think happened that day or so on. Mm-hmm. But even for myself, the cover of the Lost Rolls, it's a photograph from a protest in the West Bank. And the negative is covered with mold. And when you scan it, it turns into this beautiful sort of golden brown. And kind of the photo gods bless this negative because they basically just sort of frame around the main protester in a way that, in a way, basically, when I show it to people, they're like, that's such a cool filter. How did you do that? Yeah.
It's like I don't have that on my Instagram.
It's like an Instagram filter. So it just worked out so perfectly. So there are these amazing things that are happening and creating these different experiences through the film, especially with degradation.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess in some way there's no way to get away from the digital if there's a scanning involved or a digital printing involved, and there may be some change to the image.
Well, actually, this was a very big concern of ours. Yeah. So what we did, what I did for my book and what we're doing for the exhibitions, we got one of the best retouchers in the country, Becky Manson, from a company called the Post Office. And she would look at each negative and she would say, because a lot of the stuff we could make look perfect in Photoshop.
Yeah.
And she'd say, no, this is the damage of the negative. And this is as far as you should go, because this is what it really looks like, as opposed to let's just fix it all, which would be kind of the automatic kind of feel. So she examines each negative and says, this is the correct representation.
I respect that because I'm in the process of scanning zillions of Kodachromes that I shot over the years. And I got to a point where my scans are better than the originals in some ways. I'm opening up shadows, I'm holding back the highlights, and I'm doing control that. I know that when these pictures were taken, they would never be reproduced that well either as a print or in a magazine. There's no two ways about it. So I get what you're saying, and I think that's important that the scanning and the restoration process, okay, should be kept to what it should look like back then.
Yeah, so there's scratches, there's dust.
Yeah.
I mean, not dust created by the processing, but something embedded in the like. That's it. And people are like, "No, can't we clean this up?" I'm like, "No, you can't."
But it's so easy.
No, I want it.
Right.
We want it to be represented as it is.
And you find a difference in responses or the comments that come from folks who are photo professionals or in the photo world, as opposed to, somebody who isn't a regular person in that sense, or when it comes to these family memories, it all kind of boils down.
Everybody's super excited, yeah.
Yeah. But
whether it's even professional or amateur, it's the same.
I would guess that you wouldn't, if you didn't know the professional by name, you would not be able to tell based on the comments.
By their comments and their memories, yeah.
Yeah, it's they're not writing as professional photographers. They're writing as a person with an intimate connection to a photo they haven't seen ever before.
Yeah.
Very much like a diary.
Yeah.
It reads very much like a diary. It's
or a ripped out page of a diary.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of it. I think it's one of the really nice parts
one
of
of
it.
the things that I really like about the archive that requires that connection between photographer and image, that's specific to Lost Worlds America, is that when you zoom out and you look at a breadth of images in the archive, you start to see the way America wants to represent itself, right? When you turn over the power of who are you and how do you want to be remembered historically, then you see how the population sees itself. And so we see trends in the archive. They're less dominated by the visual aspects of, what makes a good, quote unquote, good photo. And they're dominated more so by themes. So some of the things that you can look back over decades and the things that people will self-select are family, childhood, travel, pets.
Lost loves.
Yeah, lost loves. I mean, it's really
that.
nice to see, who is America? How does America want to define itself? These don't go down in the history books, but they're so important.
There's no interest in, at this point anyway, in blending roles from someone from another country or another culture necessarily.
No, but there will be Lost Worlds Japan,
right.
Lost Worlds Europe, Lost Worlds. Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is not a film. This film situation is not unique to America.
No, of course not.
But what is interesting, and to follow up on what Lauren was saying, is kind of like the next iteration of our national tour is basically inspired by this very idea. So I was standing in front of one of the exhibitions and looking at a photograph of two young kids playing with a quote from the mom. And they're two white kids, and an African-American woman walked over and looked at it, and she goes, "Yeah, those are my kids. That's what it's like to be a mom." And it was right there where it registered to me, like what Lost Worlds America was representing, was this idea of being America and how, in actuality, we're actually more alike than different. Mm-hmm. And given today's political climate where you're red, I'm blue, I'm anti, you're pro, in actuality, using what Lauren just said about these shared experiences where, Christmases and holidays and all these different things that people can kind of look at and see themselves in, is something that we're really going to explore. So the idea is for when the next tour is that we'll say to the next city that we're coming to in a few months, "Hey, we're coming to your city, send in your film." Mm-hmm. They'll send in their film. We'll have a dedicated portion of the exhibition, which will be just for that place. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to invite people that sent in their film to come and speak with each other about their experiences based on the film.
Great.
So a grandfather talking to a teenager, a Democrat talking with a Republican, but not talking about politics, just talking about
family, shared.
Exactly, what's so cool about this photographer growing up here or whatever. And I think it's, I think it has such a really incredibly positive effect on the communities that we're going to go and visit.
It's funny, the photos I looked at, the one of a set of kids, and I guess it was the Philadelphia Marathon. I don't know why that one struck me so much. I just read about the comment, and it was just a mom remembering that day and looking back at her kids and talking about how they've grown and come to where they are now. And it just, it touched me. What can I tell you? It's weird how these little things will get to you,
Yeah, it really is, again, going back to the amount of time that people spent at the exhibitions, this resonates.
Any surprises, anything that didn't even dawn on you up front that might be coming out of all of this?
I think that people are so interested in stories that on the surface you would think were like, and
mundane.
They're just like mundane. They're just like, no, this is like, wow, and interesting and connecting. This is me, and this is my cousin, and this is this, and this is that. And also this opportunity for them to express the people that contribute. We have the contributors who are also viewers, and then we have just the viewers. And kind of that interaction between those groups are for me, have been incredibly fascinating to watch.
I think the pictures themselves are, again, mostly mundane, but the comments are just as rich as they get. And to me, it's a photographic project, but to me, it's more about reading and getting into people's heads and just seeing how people are about.
I mean, cameras have been they've been a part of American culture for over a century, right? They're in homes, so they're there and they're documenting all the quote unquote unseen moments, and those moments all add up to this history that doesn't usually get paid attention to. And I think, I guess it's kind of what we've been saying, but I think that for me is really remarkable, that people want to know other people's stories. Right? They want to share their stories, and they see connections between themselves and others, and want to know other people's stories.
Which is why we have this organization called PhotoWings, who gave us a grant to develop a curriculum for high school students, which Lauren can explain a little bit more about.
So PhotoWings is supporting this. It's a national high school curriculum. I am working on it with Generation Human Rights, which is a phenomenal organization that does educational material and works really smartly with visual materials. And the thought is, okay, we've got this rising generation that doesn't even know what a film-based photograph is. Actually, we had a bunch of third graders, I think, visit us at Photoville, and they loved it. They came inside the camper and they sat down and they looked at the pictures. There was one picture of a bunch of corgis, these little dogs.
Yeah.
And they were all like, oh, I love dogs. And so I started talking to them about their family photo albums, and they said, what albums?
What's an album?
They said, what's an album?
Yeah.
But they loved the experience of looking at photographs. They sat there for a long time. They looked through the book, just as all the adult visitors do. So the curriculum is with that generation in mind, and it's a bit on history of photography, but it takes Lost Rolls America. It takes the archive as a starting point for what is an archive, what's the value of documenting our own lives, how do we document those lives, what's the value of photography, what kind of histories can you learn from photography, how can you tell your own story, your family story, your generation story, your community story using photography. I mean, it's such a magical, compelling medium. That these third graders who didn't know what a photo album was wanted to know more.
Can you guys talk about what plans and hopes you have for the project coming up forward? Not necessarily, well, please talk about the tour or anything else, but going to Japan or opening it up in another country or monetizing it, or what thoughts are there going forward?
All those.
Okay.
Their curriculum hopefully will be finished soon, and then I think they're expecting it to be available for schools for 2020. 2020. Mm-hmm. And the tour as well.
I'm sorry. How is that something that you then present to the schools as an option? Would you like to incorporate this curriculum into your social studies class or your arts class, and then they say yes and they'll purchase it or something?
Yeah, it's for free.
Okay, for free. Yeah,
it's a free curriculum. It's generationhumanrights.org, and that's where schools or teachers can locate it, and it does meet high school core standards, so that it's a great curriculum, but it's also fulfilling what students need to be learning.
And it's also about gathering these random rolls of film?
Yeah, we are asking students to work with their families to look backwards at what their own family archives are like. But it's also meant for a rising generation. So we're not throwing away the digital, right? And a lot of students will use computers and use their phones. But it's thinking about the value of photography and archives with a starting point of understanding where did photography start, and what is analog film, and what's its relationship to today, and what's the role of memory and history, and very much the average person, right? The average person is part of this role of documentation.
And then the tour as well. Well, as I mentioned before, we're going to try to engage in these community discussions and go from place to place, as well as to continue to build the archive, which I think needs to grow more and more, and I think be as representative of America as possible, and to have some impact. And then I think we'll simultaneously start to use this idea overseas in other countries. And I think it'll be really interesting to and we have to decide, would be Lost Rolls Europe, and what's the concept of European, or would it be per country.
Right.
So that's a discussion that we're having now.
Well, there's also, the fact that there's a resurgence in analog in film. I mean, as you can tell by walking through, most neighborhoods in Williamsburg or wherever, you know what I mean. But so we'll see how that plays out too in the years to come. Before we get to maybe talking some nuts and bolts and how we can kind of ask some of our listeners if they want to contribute, how does this project give you a similar sense of satisfaction than as might, going on an assignment and coming back with some great photos? I mean, is that...
Well, I think it's interesting because, both Biography of a Photo, which is looking back at the history of two photographs over the course of more than 30 years and how they impacted the world. And this is kind of all related to memory and what's happened, the power of photography. And so in that aspect, I think it's, for me, been... certainly very satisfying. I still, without question, enjoy going out and photographing and showing the world my interpretation of. My last assignment was going and working on doing the caravan. So those things are still incredibly important to me. I kind of wish I just had. Wish there was a couple extra days of the week, so there's more time to do things. But I think, by having, especially for this project, by partnering with FUJIFILM, with PhotoShelter, with PhotoWings, and then working with people like Lauren, it enables us to really have some pretty important impact. And I think having impact is really important.
And is something that you've always kind of considered and thought about as you were, a young photographer working on assignments, this idea of memory and what will these photos mean in 30 years? Or
no, absolutely not. If I had thought of that, I would have written things down. I wouldn't have, and I would have developed my film.
You would have developed your film, correct.
Cool. So tell us then, any of the requirements that people need or what they can submit, how it works. I know it's all on the website, but if you want to throw it to us.
It's open to any American or anybody that has photographed in America. And if you go to lostrollsamerica.com there and you look at under the participate tab, it'll give you a list of what you need to do. But it really is pretty simple. There's basically a sheet to download. You fill that out. You send it in. It goes to PhotoShelter, where Sophia Adams, who's working with us, will collect your film and bring it over to CRC Lab, where it'll get processed, scanned, and uploaded back to PhotoShelter. And then we will contact you by email. We'll kind of keep you each stage. You'll be alerted to what's happening.
How often do you guys get a roll of film come in?
Weekly. There's always film coming in.
Yeah, it's kind of a constant thing. Yeah.
This is very much like what they used to call time capsules, where they stuck a bunch of things into a metal tube and then bury it under the flagpole in front of the school for 20, 30, 40 years, except it's happening in real time, but it is the past. And it's an interesting dynamic where it's a time capsule that's evolving all the time and growing in depth and volume at the same time. And it ain't going to get lost.
Yeah. I mean, you asked before, something that we kind of looked at anew or thought about anew. And one of the things I absolutely love about the project is just getting to see life through all these different perspectives. It's pretty incredible. You get to step into other people for...
And it's as random as it gets, too.
Yeah. It's really nice.
So we definitely encourage all your listeners, go check out the closet, the drawer, ask your parents, going going home for a holiday, do a dig in the attic. I mean, it's amazing, like how many times we've heard from people, no, we have no film.
Sure.
And then they come back a couple of days later, oh yeah, we found a roll of film in the kitchen drawer. Or
Yeah, I've been thinking all the time, where could some of these films be?
Like even for myself, it was really amazing. After I did the book, after the book came out, I opened up a drawer filled with cameras. I picked up a camera, Contax G2, and I went and I realized I still had one more roll of film.
Yeah.
Are you holding on to that one?
I'm holding on to it for part 2.
I have 6 cameras at home, and I think 3 of them have film in it. I don't even know when I stuck them in, but there's still film in there.
There you go.
There you go. No, I want to
join
use
us.
it.
Come join us. Be one of us.
I have
Be
older
one of
rolls
us.
I'll get to you.
Okay.
I definitely will.
Right.
Okay. By the way, all of this information will be on our website and be easy to access. In the meantime, before people even get there, if people want to start getting a jump start on things, what website should they go to?
LostRollsAmerica.com. All the
Okay.
instructions are there. Send in the film, and within a few weeks, if not sooner, we'll be sending you scans.
And when will we be seeing the first episodes of the video or film versions of this? When's this going to start happening?
The film should be finished up pretty soon. It was done with the grant from the Zolberg Institute on a migration at the New School, because it's a film about, it's that immigrant's tale. So the New School may be the first screening of it, and then
In the fall, right?
ideally, and then the film series goes forward from there.
Did anybody have a eureka moment? They looked at a picture just randomly and said, wait a second, I have a connection to this. Just somebody who did not send a picture in, but they're going through the site and they go, hey, wait a second.
At Photoville, this college-age girl shows up, and she says, I'm looking for a particular photo. And she finally locates it, and it's a picture of like a 3-year-old girl sitting on a horse, and she said, oh, that's me. My mom told me to come find this photo. And then the caption is very sweet. I'm not going to remember it exactly, but it's something along the lines of, maybe like on the day the picture was taken, the 3-year-old girl was fussing and the mom was having a hard time. And she said, I thought it was stubbornness, but I realized it's actually her tenacity. And as she's grown up over the years, I really admire her as a tenacious person. And then so she posed next to her 3-year-old self, and we took a picture, and she sent it to her mom.
That's great.
It must be really, the memories of the photo taker, and in this case, the mom compared to the daughter, and obviously memories from person to person can change a lot, but it's interesting to hear these stories, that's for sure. Anyway.
Sometimes we see engagement on Instagram too, and that's kind of nice.
Oh, do you have an Instagram? Is there an Instagram?
Yeah,
page?
at Lost Rolls America.
Okay,
and those aren't always people who are in the archive, so it's nice to see conversations about photos from people who aren't the submitter or the subject.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Lauren Walsh, Ron Haviv, thank you so much. Great talking to you guys again. And again, all of the information will be on the site if you want to follow up on this. And it's well worth following up on. It's a terrific series, and you could lose yourself for a few hours looking at these photographs and reading the comments that go along with them. There's some fabulous stories going on in here. In the meantime, if you are not a subscriber to the B&H Photography Podcast, it is never too late. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Overcast, and Spotify. And you can always find this on the B&H Explorer website, not to mention the B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group, which is growing every day. Until next show, on behalf of Jason, John, and myself, thank you so much for tuning in today.